Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name's Jabio and this is my 1992 Toyota MR2. So where I left off in the last episode, I just pulled the head off, replaced the head gasket, installed some ARP head studs and put the head back on the engine. And I did mention at the end of it that I was probably going to get started into putting everything back onto the block of the engine. And today's the day where I'm going to start doing that. So over here I've got all the parts that I'm going to reinstall back on the engine today. These include like the coolant lines, the oil cooler mounting plate, baffle, pickup and all that sort of stuff, as well as the oil pump that's over here and the new water pump which is down in that box over there. I have all the gaskets and stuff laid out that I'm going to need to replace when I put everything back on the engine. I've laid them out side by side with the old stuff here so we can compare them, I guess. But over here we've got the oil pump. I've just laid in the main sort of oil pump O-ring in there just for now. And here we've got the rest of the seals such as the oil cooler O-rings, the gasket for the oil pickup, the oil pump shaft seal. That's for the dipstick there. Got the two hoses from Hell, the two coolant bypass lines. Got the idler pulleys here, new tensioner, new front and rear main seals as well as the cam seals. Also have all the new water pump seals and stuff, which is down there with the water pump. If we just compare all the old stuff here with the new stuff here, you can see that it's all old, crusty, covered in oil and just can't really be reused again. Compared with all the new stuff here, which is nice and shiny, all genuine Toyota parts on this bench here, as well as the stuff in that box and the rest of the gaskets which are sitting on the boot of the car over there. And to get all this stuff done, I've also got a couple of sockets here that match the size of the cam seals and stuff, which will help me tap them in, as well as a torque wrench so I can sort of meet the factory specs for tightening everything down. I've also got some multi-purpose lithium grease here which will help with lubricating up the seals as we tap them in, and that will mainly be for the front main seal and the cam seals there on the engine. So to get started with this, I'll probably get on to doing the oil pump first. After that I'll probably look at mounting that to the block here, and then start looking at doing the water pump after that and attaching the oil cooler and the coolant lines that go around the side of it. So just before I start putting it all back together, just a quick note is this is the oil pump shaft seal which goes around this part here on the pump rotor and sits inside this rotor cover here, I guess. It sits in like that, just down here. What a lot of people have a tendency to do is they tap this in too deep and they actually manage to block off that little hole down there. What you actually want to do is you want to tap it in just enough so that the seal is flush with the top of the housing there. What that does is it still allows oil to get in through that hole and behind the seal to lube up the rotor shaft. If you don't do that right first time, you might damage the seal when you're pulling it out and you may have to replace it again. And the same also goes for the front main seal and the cam seals. They do have little passages where oil likes to sort of come through and sit behind the oil seal. And some people do like to tap it in a bit too deep and that can cause lubrication issues and stuff like that. so I finally managed to get most of the stuff back on the engine, including pretty much all of the timing stuff that needed to go on as well. I'll just show you what I did. So I started with getting the oil pump on, which had the papery gasket on the back of it. And then once that was done, I moved on to chucking the oil cooler mounting plate and the oil cooler on, as well as the water pump. Next was to chuck on the coolant hardlines here, as well as the two hoses from hell, the one on this side and on this side. I don't know if you could see in the video, but I actually put some sort of car wash and stuff on the lines on each side, just so that they could slide in and out a bit easier and it would be easier to fit. All that's left to do on this hose here is to pull off these little retaining clips here. Once those are pulled out, these hose clamps will tighten down on the hose and keep it secure. I did put some blue Loctite on this nut here, as well as all the other bolts that hold the timing stuff to the engine. The Toyota manual doesn't exactly say to do that, but I thought, you know, some blue Loctite never hurt. But next up will be to chuck the timing belt on, and then put the lower timing cover on and the harmonic balancer so we can start setting the timing. Once that's sort of in the right place, I'll go ahead and chuck on the tensioner which goes there. Pull the pin on the tensioner so it tightens everything up. Give it a few revolutions just to see where the timing's at. If it's out, I'll have to take the tensioner off and redo it all. But hopefully we get lucky and get it first try. So I've gone ahead and I've just lightly put on the timing belt on the engine. Normally what you would do is you would set the cams and the crank to top dead center. On this engine you can tell if the cams are at top dead center if this dot here on the cam lines up with this groove on the upper timing cover. There's also a reference on the back of the #1 cam cap and on the cam. So if you make sure those all line up on both sides, that's how you can tell that these cams are set at top dead center. Same goes for the crank. I just chucked on the lower timing cover as well as the crank pulley, and then I just turned it until it lined up with 0 on the lower timing cover. And you can sort of eyeball it as well if you set the keyway on the crank pulley directly up. But the way I have put this timing belt on, I've set it so that this green line on the timing belt here actually lines up with the top of the water pump. So according to the manual, once I put the lower timing cover on, that green line should line up with the top edge of this lower timing cover. The reason for doing that is because this timing belt doesn't have any sort of marks or indicators to show that it's in the right spot. Some timing belts will have a mark that shows that it's supposed to be right above this dot here. Same goes for this dot, as well as the crank pulley as well. In this case, my crank pulley and my timing belt don't really have any marks except for that line. So according to the manual, I can use this line to line it up with the top of the water pump and the top of the lower timing cover. So next up, I'm probably just going to chuck the lower timing cover on and then put the crank pulley on, and then I'll start going through the steps of the manual to set the timing and make sure it's all correct and stuff. So you can see here that after putting the lower timing cover on and the crank pulley, the groove on the crank pulley here lines up with the 0, which means that the crank is at top dead center. Next up will be to install the tensioner, where you'll remove these 2 bolts and then just loosely put the tensioner on. The tensioner looks like this, and it has a small sort of pin that sits inside of it. Once this is on the engine, what you'll do is you'll tighten this down with a spanner or something like that, and then pull the pin out, and what that will do is it'll let this rod pop out. Once that rod pops out, it'll push down on this plate and put tension on the tensioner, tightening up the timing belt on the engine. So now that I've got the tensioner on, the Toyota manual recommends that I chuck on the crank pulley and the bolt and then slowly turn it clockwise until the timing groove on the pulley here lines up with the center of this mark on the lower timing cover. Cool, so I've got the tensioner on. This is torqued down as well as this, and I've checked the clearance in there with a 1.9mm feeler gauge, and it seems to be pretty good. The next step that the manual recommends is to then remove this grenade pin here. So I'll go ahead and do that, which will apply tension to this tensioner, and then we'll crank the engine over and see how all our timing marks line up. If this isn't correct, then I'll have to pull this off, reset it, and then redo the timing belt. So after cranking the engine over a couple of times, I'm actually off by one tooth on the exhaust cam here. I can tell just by lining up this dot with this groove up here. This one lines up perfectly and the crank pulley is at top dead center. And because this one's not, I will have to take the tensioner off and then redo this. So I'll go ahead and keep doing this until I get it right, and then I'll show you what it looks like at the end. So it's actually the next day now. I did manage to finally get the timing belt on properly last night. I did have to do it one other time after that first time, but what I found after doing it the first time was that the timing belt was out by one tooth up the top. I don't know if you remember. When I did it the second time, I pulled the tensioner off. What you have to do after taking the tensioner off is you have to put the tensioner in a vise and clamp it down slowly and put the pin back in. This is just to recompress the sort of rod that pushes against the idler, stop it in there. Once I did that, I put the timing belt back on with some like clothes pegs or something up here, just to make sure that it didn't move up here. After laying it all around, I set the timing belt off by one tooth down at the crank pulley. I just used some paint marker as a reference on the belt and on the crank pulley. After doing that, I followed the manual and it tells you to do a couple of revolutions of the engine and then pull the pin on the tensioner. So I pulled the pin on the tensioner and then cranked it over again, and it turned out that putting it out by one tooth actually helped the timing belt line up. So now that I've got it all at top dead center, the keyway and the cams are all pointing upwards, which is good. And I used the lower timing cover marks as a reference to ensure that this was in the right place. The two cam dots here are lining up with the grooves on the cover on the back there. I found that the Gen 2 3S GTE engine doesn't have too many indicators as to where things should be aligned when you're doing the timing belt change. I found out last night that there is actually a tiny little casting mark on the oil pump there, which helps you line up the keyway, I guess, but there's no sort of indication on the crank pulley or the oil pump around here to show that this is also oriented right. So by just pulling the lower timing cover on and off over and over again, I was able to make sure that this was lined up, as well as making sure the cams were lined up. I had a tendency to just get a 14mm spanner on here and the big spanner on the cam, just to make sure that there was tension across the top and to ensure that these were in the right spot at all times. That's a lot of the main stuff out of the way. So the big jobs were getting this done, fixing the oil leaks and getting the head gasket on. Now that that's all done, I can finish putting on the extra components like the oil pump, the pickup, the alternator and stuff like that. But next up in the next video, I'm probably going to get started on putting the turbo together. I have the CT26 turbo and the ATS Racing Billet CT20B turbo. The CT20B Billet turbo, or CT21 turbo that I've got, is missing a few components to make it a good running turbo setup. Just the sort of lines and the gaskets and the studs and things like that. So what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to take parts from the 26 setup that I had and cut and change a few parts between the two setups to make one good running setup. And that will be the last major sort of component that needs to go on the engine to get this thing running again. Once the engine is back in the car, I'm also going to be pulling off the valve cover and getting it powder coated, probably in a deeper, darker yellow as well. That'll help tidy up the engine a lot. This, I would say, is probably the thing that's letting the engine down in terms of sort of looks and stuff at the moment. I mean, I've cleaned off most of the gunk, but this here and all its cracked paint and stuff is making the engine look a bit ugly, so I'll be fixing that later on as well. So that's going to be all from me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you guys learned something. I definitely did, because I've never done this sort of job on this engine before. But let me know what you thought of the video down below, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace!